Hi everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about social learning theory. So historically, the theory kind of developed over time, and we'll talk about kind of three theories within this general theoretical framework. So we're going to start out with Sutherland's differential association theory. Differential association theory basically was developed by Edwin Sutherland, who is arguably one of the most influential criminologists of the 20th century. He's the first to develop a general sociological theory of crime and deviance and really started to study crime from a sociological perspective. Before, it was not really necessarily always studied from a strictly sociological perspective. Specifically, Edwin Sutherland noticed when looking at some of these other theories, they all really focused kind of on violent property crime and did a really, really poor job explaining white-collar crime. In fact, a lot of the things that a lot of the theories that have been developed were developed to suggest that it's people from poor class communities, less wealthy communities, and really everything that white-collar criminals are not. And so he realized we need to come up with a new theory that can explain this big type of crime because it's a growing type of crime that's important to know and understand, right? So differential association theory has 9 basic propositions that basically says that criminal behavior is learned from those around you, right? So what are those 9 propositions? Well, the first of the propositions is that criminal behavior is learned. Right? This is a learned behavior. Like any other behavior, crime is learned. And the second proposition is it's learned in interaction with other persons in a process of communicating. So it's learned in some sort of communicative process. The third idea is that the learning of criminal behavior occurs within intimate personal groups. You're not learning it from random people on the street. You're learning it from the people that are around you, in these intimate personal groups around you. Not only is it learned through communication, through people around you, but you learn not only the techniques of crime, but also the direction of motives. Why am I doing this? It's not just good enough to say, here's how you break into a car, right? If I taught all of you how to hotwire a car, that's all well and good, but if you don't understand why in the world we're hotwiring a car, you're probably not going to hotwire a car, right? So on top of all that, the motives are learned from definitions of legal codes as either favorable or unfavorable, right? So you need to look at these things as, is this legal or illegal? The sixth idea here is that a person may become delinquent because of an excess of definitions favorable to law violation over definitions unfavorable to law violation. Also, another aspect of differential association is that it may vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. There are certain people that you're with a lot for long periods of time who you respect a lot, right? And so you're probably going to adapt those definitions more so that you're going to adapt other people's definitions. The process of learning by association with criminals involves all the mechanisms as any other learning, right? So whether you're learning math or learning how to be a criminal, differential association suggests the learning takes place the same. And it also suggests that crime not explained by needs and values of the criminal, it's not explained by the needs and values of the criminal because other non-criminal behavior can be explained by those same needs and values. There are some theories, right, that we'll talk about later in this lecture that say the reason people commit crime is because they're poor, right? Well, that could be true, but people also go out and get jobs because they're poor. So why are some people committing crimes when they're poor, but some people getting jobs and working, right? So differential association says we can't just look for these simplistic answers like because they're poor, because there are non-criminal behaviors that are explained by those same needs and values. Now already, hopefully this is jumping out at you as not a very parsimonious theory, right? Because there are 9 variables here associated with the theory. So criminal behavior is learned in a process of symbolic interaction with others. And the basic idea of symbolic interaction, right, is people acting towards something based on the meaning they have for that thing. So for example, if you see someone wearing a black suit with a bow tie, cufflinks, a cummerbund, right, they're fairly dressed up, you are going to treat that person differently. Why? Is it because that person is different? No, not really. It's because all of those things that person is wearing are all symbols of some sort of status. So if you see someone walking down St. George Street in a tuxedo, you probably think either they've just left a wedding or they're going to some very formal event, right? Regardless of what the truth is. You could take a homeless person, give them a shower, and throw them in a tuxedo, and throw them right back on the street being homeless, and you will still treat them differently because that clothing is a symbol. A perfect example of this is, I don't know how often you guys ever go into Lowe's or Home Depot, but there are times after work, and I typically wear at least a shirt and tie to work, that I'll run into Home Depot to get light bulbs, or last year my wife and I painted our bedroom, and so I had to pick up some paint, and I was in a shirt and tie when I walked into Home Depot. The store practically ground to a halt. Every single employee I walked past stopped me and grabbed me and say, "Hey, do you need help? What can I do to help you? You clearly look lost. Let me help you," right? That night, my wife and I realized we did not buy enough paint to paint the room. So I went back to buy more paint. But this time I was in a bunch of schleppy clothes because we were painting, right? So it was a bunch of clothes I didn't care about. I walked back in, walked up to the same lady who mixed the paint for me, and had to ask her for help. She wasn't particularly friendly, and it wasn't until I said, "Remember, I was in here earlier," that she even remembered who I was, right? Because the symbols of a shirt and tie versus, gym shorts and an undershirt are different, right? So the sixth statement in the theory is viewed as the most important of all of the statements. And the sixth statement here is, person may become delinquent because of an excess of definitions favorable to law violation over definitions unfavorable to law violation, right? And these are definitions or rationalizations toward crime is the basic idea here, right? I'm committing crime because of whatever the case may be, right? And you hear rationalizations toward crime all over the place, right? It's okay if I smoke weed because it's natural, right? Or it's okay if I speed because I'm keeping up with the flow of traffic. Or I slowed down for the stop sign. It doesn't matter that I didn't stop, right? These are all kind of definitions that say it's okay to commit crime because I've got this rationalization or this other idea toward criminality. So criminals may learn deviant definitions from law-abiding citizens and vice versa also, right? Just because somebody has learned a definition does not mean the person they learned it from is necessarily deviant. And similarly, you can learn conforming definitions from criminals, right? Kind of a do as I say, not as I do thing. The thing that matters the most is the modalities of association, right? Typically, right, the definitions you hear first, more frequently, over a longer period of time, and with greater intensity, are the definitions you are going to subscribe to, right? So, for example, a lot of us probably grew up in households that said drinking is bad. You shouldn't drink alcohol, right? And you may have heard that a lot growing up for a long period of time. And so when you guys came to college, you guys didn't drink, or at least you didn't drink in high school. Maybe you started drinking in college or something. I don't know your life. But you can see where it's like, no, I didn't do any of this stuff. Then I went to college, and now I'm doing these things, right? But that's because the first definition you heard from your parents, who have a lot of power over you, frequently over your whole life, you listened to. But then what happened when you went to college? Sure, there was a frequency in a longer period of time, and it clearly wasn't the definition you heard first, but the intensity of all your friends going out and drinking suddenly became different. The people you started hanging out with a lot then, so then even the frequency as far as the first 3 or 4 months of college suddenly changed, and it was no longer your parents, it was your friends. And so you can see how people can suddenly change their definitions as to what's deviant or not deviant based on that in a fairly quick amount of time. So Sutherland stated all the mechanisms of learning are present in his theory, but never really clarified what those mechanisms were. So Akers and Burgess wrote Differential Association Reinforcement Theory to try and help combine what are those learning mechanisms, because you can't just say, one of the things that makes a theory bad is if there's a lot of assumptions or we're not very clear about what it is. And so Akers and Burgess said, well, let's operationalize some of these things, and they developed differential association and reinforcement theory. This new theory combined differential association from Sutherland with operant and respondent conditioning in psychology, right? And again, this is not in competition with differential association, but merely an extension of the theory. Sutherland was on the right track, according to Akers and Burgess. We're taking it a step further to make it more specific. So what they did was they kept differential association and operationalized the behavioral terms differently and came up with 4 kind of basic variables that were there: differential reinforcement, classic or respondent conditioning, discriminative stimuli, and schedules of reinforcement. And the theory still maintained this symbolic interaction of differential association, but it made the theory more soft behaviorism as opposed to a more radical concept. So yeah, there's these symbolic interactions. We can resist those, though, in some ways. And so it's kind of a little softer. It's a little kind of took off the edges a little bit, right? But these four variables that became a little bit cumbersome, and so the theory needed to be refined a little bit, a couple times over testing. And so they developed into the four main concepts we know in social learning. Now, it's important to note that learning in social learning theory is not just limited to deviant behavior. It also does a really good job of explaining conforming behavior, and actually does a pretty good job of explaining a lot of different behaviors, right? And we'll talk about that as we go through the theory. But the major concepts that are now widely recognized in social learning theory are differential association, definitions favorable and unfavorable to crime, differential reinforcement, and imitation. So, the first variable in social learning theory is differential association. This changed from Sutherland to Akers. Differential association theory is a different idea and different concept, even though this variable called differential association is present in social learning theory. Whereas in differential association theory, the basic idea was if you have a bunch of definitions favorable toward law violation, you're going to commit crime. In social learning theory, differential association is an interactional dimension that measures your association with others, like your friends and your family, and your indirect association with distant reference groups. So essentially, it's who do you hang out with? Who do you choose to spend your time with? What online groups do you choose to be with? What do you identify as a person? So for example, I am a straight white Christian male, right? So that is how I would operationalize myself or define myself in a demographic way. So that means that I probably associate with probably a lot of other straight white Christian people, right? And so I might have these distant reference groups that I identify with, as well as the close friends and family that I identify with. This association is also a normative dimension. So there are different patterns of norms an individual is exposed to throughout this association. So for example, both my parents have advanced degrees, my older brother has an advanced degree, and my two best friends have advanced degrees. Because of all of that, right, the norm in my family as well as my friend group is to get an advanced degree. Right? Now, granted, one's a pharmacist, one has an MBA, one's a medical doctor, one's an attorney. My brother's got a master's degree in history. So there's a bunch of different types of advanced degrees, but in general, the norm is you don't just stop at a bachelor's degree in my direct group, right? Even my wife has a master's degree. Whereas for, like my stepbrother, for example, even though he was raised half in the same family, right? His mom doesn't have a college degree. My stepmom does not have a college degree. Neither does his father. The friends he hangs out with don't have college degrees, and so he didn't feel bad about dropping out of high school or think it was weird to drop out of high school, get his GED, and just work, right? Because the norms for his group and the people he's exposed to is different, right? So the social group one is involved with plays a role in every other category of learning, and we'll see how that works, right? So basically, differential association determines the definitions that you will accept as favorable or unfavorable to crime, the imitation, who you're going to imitate, and who is and what is reinforcing you to continue doing those behaviors. What about online groups? This is one of the big questions, is what about online groups? If you're in a chat room or something. Well, we've seen in the past couple of years with the rise of ISIS that online groups are clearly very, very effective in radicalizing certain types of people, right? And so online groups can also be a form of an association that affects criminality. So the next variable in social learning theory is definitions favorable and unfavorable toward crime. This is differential association from Sutherland. All right, so again, I keep stating that, and I know it's really repetitive, but I want to make sure you guys remember the difference between Sutherland's differential association and Akers' differential association. Akers equals friends, Sutherland equals definitions. So these definitions, favorable or unfavorable to crime, are one's own attitude that you attach to any sort of given behavior, right? A rationalization or a moral attitude. It's okay that I drink underage because it's college, everyone drinks. One of the things actually that I knew people in college who felt this way, and I'm not certainly suggesting that I agree with this by any stretch of the imagination, but they said you can't binge drink in college because it's college, right? That's a rationalization to say it's okay if I drink a lot. Now, that's wrong, right? It's obviously not good to binge drink, but that's how people sometimes rationalize that kind of drinking behavior, right? There are general definitions and specific definitions also, right? We have religious or moral values and norms, kind of big, broad concepts, versus specific definitions that orient people to specific acts or series of acts. These specific definitions, you'll usually see people try and get off on quote-unquote technicalities with these specific definitions, right? I know one big one that people wrestle with quite a bit, especially in churches and stuff, is the Bible is pretty clear that you should only sleep with one person in your life, and that's your spouse, right? And so what a lot of people who go to churches is or even Bill Clinton when he was our president, you redefine what is sex, right? Well, I did certain acts, but not other acts, right? And so those certain acts are not actually technically sex, and so therefore I am still waiting for my spouse, right? Well, I don't think if Jesus came down and watched, he would say, yes, that's what I meant, right? But regardless, it orients you to the specific act or series of acts versus these larger groups, right? So it's morally wrong to steal. Everyone knows that, but smoking weed, that's okay, right? A fun exercise I always do with intro classes is say to them, who here, don't raise your hand, but who here identifies as a criminal? And most people don't. And I'm like, okay, again, don't raise your hand, but just start asking yourself, have you ever drank underage? You ever smoked weed? You ever taken money out of your parents' wallet or purse without asking? And then people suddenly start saying, oh, well, that's not criminal. I thought you meant real crime. And they start throwing out actually what their definitions are. Is, oh, come on, if I had a beer, but that's not a big deal. In Europe, they drink wine when they're 12, right? And we'll start throwing out all these rationalizations as to why what they did isn't actually criminal. There are also different types of definitions that are present in criminality, right? There are negative definitions, which means this act is bad, negative, that are conventional kind of law-abiding beliefs. I do not smoke weed because it's illegal to smoke weed, and therefore I do not smoke weed, right? There are positive definitions, or beliefs that make law violation desirable, right? Weed is natural. Weed can help people with cancer. Weed should be used medicinally, so I smoke weed. Technically a doctor didn't prescribe it to me, but I know I need it, right? And then there's neutralizing definitions, which are justifying or excusing deviant behavior. I didn't realize there was weed in the cigarette when I smoked it, or all my friends were doing it, so I just did it. A really common one you hear is, I was drunk and I didn't know what I was doing, right? I didn't mean to do whatever it was. I didn't mean to say that hurtful thing to you or share that secret that I was sworn to secrecy on, but I was drunk, and so I can't be held responsible for what happened. These definitions that you have, again, are developed through your associations as well as through imitating other people's definitions and being reinforced for certain types of definitions, right? If you go up to a group of people that are all smoking weed and say, I think smoking weed is bad, what are they probably going to do? Argue with you and yell at you, right? So you're probably not going to hang out with them. Whereas if your whole friend group smokes weed, odds are you're probably smoking weed as well. There's also differential reinforcement, right? And this is the balance of anticipated or actual, and that's important, anticipated or actual rewards and punishments that follow behavior. This is very, very basic behaviorism at its root. I think people are going to think it's funny if I make this joke, so I'm going to do it. Whether they think it's funny or not is irrelevant because you think they're going to laugh. Same thing with crime. I think my friends are going to think it's cool if I do this thing. I think I'm going to get told it was hilarious if I do this thing. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and do it, right? There's different types of reinforcement, and you definitely need to make sure you understand the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. This is something that people mess up a lot. The media uses it wrong a lot. In society, we use it wrong all the time. Positive reinforcement is the addition of something good, right? Positive, you're adding something. That's receiving a positive stimulus or a good stimulus for a behavior. I tell my dog, sit, she sits, I give her a cookie. I have introduced a cookie, given her added a cookie to this equation. She's going to keep sitting because she's hoping to get a cookie. The negative reinforcement is the removal of an adversive stimulus for a behavior. I throw a choke collar on my dog. If she pulls, it chokes her. If she eases off and doesn't pull, it doesn't choke her. Easing off is removing the choking aspect, and therefore she doesn't pull, right? She's going to continue to not pull because she doesn't want to get choked out, right? So again, there's modalities of reinforcement here. The amount, frequency, and probability of the reinforcer all affect whether or not you are reinforced. So obviously, the more frequently you're reinforced and the level of reinforcement are strong. For example, if every time I did the dishes, my wife gave me a kiss, I might continue to do the dishes, right? Dishes obviously get dirty every day, and so there's a lot of kisses happening, right? And that's the amount, so it's a high amount, several times a day, frequency, daily, and then the probability of the reinforcer, right? What if my wife's not home? Am I super tempted to do the dishes? Well, no one's there to kiss me if my wife's not there, right? And so I might not do it because there's not a high probability of that reinforcer being present. I might wait till she's home to then do the dishes, right? Same thing is true with crime, right? A lot of people are not going to commit crime if they think no one's going to know about it, and they're not going to get reinforced for it. Like, hey, like right now, robbing a bank, if you go into a bank with a gun, no one does it anymore. Why? Because the reinforcer, the money you would steal, isn't there, right? Because you're gonna get caught, and you're not going to benefit from it really in any particular way. Something that's important to note about reinforcement is that reinforcement can be non-social as well as social, right? You might be reinforced to continue drinking underage because you like the feeling of being drunk, right? You might drink alone in your dorm room because you enjoy the feeling of being drunk, right? There's also things like genetic sensation seeking. Some of you might love skydiving or base jumping or some other weird thing that I don't do that seems like it's a lot of effort because you like the rush of doing whatever it is that you're doing, right? That is enough to reinforce you to continue doing it. A buddy of mine who's now a neurosurgery resident, right? He's about to graduate and be a brain surgeon, would not, regardless of what we did, hang out with us on Friday and Saturday nights in undergrad. Nothing we could do no names we could call him, nothing we could do could make him hang out with us because he had non-social reinforcement. He was, and we'll get down to it at the bottom of the slide here, he was self-reinforced. He said, I don't care to go out with you guys because I want to get into med school, the best med school possible, so I can get the best residency possible, so I can be the best doctor possible. I don't really care what you think. I'm self-reinforcing, right? So there's obviously social reinforcement, which is reinforcement from peers and family, non-social reinforcement, which are kind of unconditional physiological or psychological stimuli that are reinforcing you in some capacity, and then there's self-reinforcement, where individuals exercise self-control for their own reinforcement. Imitation is the final variable in social learning theory, right? This is engagement in behavior after observation of similar behavior in others, right? I see someone else do something, so I'm going to try and do it too. Kylie Jenner has big lips, so I'm going to suck on a Coke can or whatever it was that you had to do to get big lips because people seem to like Kylie Jenner's big lips, right? Imitation basically happens due to vicarious reinforcement, right? So you see the consequences of someone else's behavior and say, I want those consequences too. And I'm sure everyone has been in this situation, right? Someone in a group says something hilarious. Everyone laughs. Then someone else jumps in and tries to say something funny also, and it just crashes and burns. And everyone's like, why did you talk? We were all laughing. It was hilarious until you spoke, right? You ruined it. What that person was doing, though, is they were being vicariously reinforced to try and make a joke. It just didn't work out. Sometimes they're vicariously reinforced to make a joke, they make a joke, and it works, and it's even funnier, right? But you see the consequence of someone else's behavior and say, I want that for me, so I'm going to try and do that also. That's why a lot of times when a new big movie is released about something, the interest in that topic suddenly shoots up. So like after the Hunger Games, interest in bow and arrow shooting, especially among females, shot through the roof. Because everyone thought, Katniss is cool, I want to be like Katniss, a bow and arrow will make me like Katniss, right? Air Jordans. When Michael Jordan played with his basketball shoes, everyone thought, I can play basketball like Michael Jordan if I just had those shoes. No one ever thought to look at themselves and be like, yeah, it's definitely not the shoes. Because Michael Jordan was probably that good barefoot. Imitation is more important in behavior acquisition than it is in the maintenance of behavior, but it still does play somewhat of a role, right? And so it's important to note that detail, that imitation is definitely more important in the acquisition rather than the maintenance of behavior. Social learning also is a process with reciprocal and feedback effects, and that's important. The behavior is constantly being reinforced or punished in some capacity or another, right? And so it might be that, for example, growing up, your parents may have said, wow, your room is always messy, it's a constant mess. Why is it always messy? If you clean your room and keep it clean for a week, I'll give you $5. So you clean your room and you keep it clean for a week. And they give you $5. They say, okay, if you keep it clean for a second week, you get another $5. And you keep it clean for a second week and you get another $5. By the third week, you forget to even ask and your room just kind of stays clean, right? Or you ask and they say, listen, I'm not giving you $5 every week to keep your room clean, just keep it clean now. Clearly it's not that hard. And then slowly your room might degrade, right? Also, as people mature and grow up, definitions change a lot, right? So, for example, in undergrad, right, you guys right now, maybe, I don't know how the world is today, but based on the movies and TV shows I've seen, right, people are reinforced for drinking heavy amounts and doing stupid stuff, at least in movies, right? When they're in college, at least, right? And so maybe from the ages of 18 to 22, 23, 24, you're reinforced for doing crazy stuff and drinking a lot. But as you get older, if you're 30, 35 years old and you're that guy at the bar, suddenly you become creepy dude, right? You're no longer getting reinforced. You're no longer associating with the same groups of people, right? I actually was in Gainesville. It took me 9 years from undergraduate to PhD. And so as time moved on, there were different places you went to hang out and even different times you went to bed because of social learning, right? Who you associated with. In undergrad, it might not be weird to stay out till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. By my last year of grad school, if I was out past 10 o'clock, I was not going to sleep or I was not going to be able to be productive the next day because I'd be so tired, right? Now, if you see me out past 9 o'clock, it's a real miracle. Because as time goes on and as you grow up, as responsibilities change, as you hang out with different groups of people, your behavior changes because it's being reinforced by different groups. There's different expectations of you, right? You're imitating different people. I am now not interested in imitating an 18 or 19-year-old. I try and imitate other faculty members, right? Definitions also may not be defined prior to initiation of deviant behavior, and they might not even be present until after the act occurs, right? There are so many people that either define behaviors as bad until they do it the first time, or suddenly are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. I didn't die. I guess it's not that bad, right? And one that jumps out a lot that people and this is research, not just Josh talking or Dr. Beal talking, but one that jumps out a lot in research is drinking and driving behaviors. A lot of people either have really, really strong opinions that drinking and driving is bad, or are like, well, I'm not really sure what I feel about it, but lean toward it being bad until they drink and drive for the first time. And by the way, research suggests a majority of people have driven when they shouldn't have, consuming alcohol, right? Then suddenly the definition changes. It might start with, if I have a drop of alcohol, I'm never going to drive. Then it's like, well, I had 1 glass of wine and I drove home and that wasn't bad, so that's okay. Then it was, well, I had 1.5 glasses. Then it was 2 glasses. Then it was like it was only 1 shot. And then eventually it gets to the point where maybe you're really driving when you shouldn't. But when you make it home safe, suddenly your definition changes, right? And it's, well, really, it's not that bad. I'm really good at it. Or it's not that dangerous, right? People come up with all sorts of weird definitions about drinking and driving after they've done it for the first time, right? And again, this is not me excusing drinking and driving. I'm not suggesting it's a good thing, but it's how people's definitions change after this initiation of that deviant behavior. So one of the extensions, I said there was 3 theories we're really going to talk about. We talked about differential association. Now we've talked about social learning theory. Now there's an extension of social learning theory called social structure and social learning, right? And this theory basically posits that the social structure one lives in has an indirect relationship with crime as well. But the social structure has a strong relationship with all of these social learning variables. So if you were to look at it kind of mathematically or in a path model here, your social structure affects the social learning variables of differential association, reinforcement, definitions, and imitation, and that affects whether or not you're going to commit crime or you're going to conform to criminality. So the four variables within social structure, social learning, are differential social organization, differential location in the social structure, theoretically defined structural variables, and differential social location in groups. And we'll talk about all these in detail. So the differential social organization refers to the structural correlates of crime in the community that affect rates of crime and delinquency. So for example, right, the age composition, the population density, or other variables that lean societies toward or away from crime structurally, right? So the organization of society. So if you think about New York City or Chicago and compare them to St. Augustine, Florida, there are different structural or social organizations of those cities, right? The average age composition in St. Augustine is somewhere around 103, right? Whereas in New York and Chicago, it's considerably younger. The population in St. Augustine is much more spread out. There's only 13,000 people that actually live in St. Augustine compared to New York and Chicago that have 13,000 people in any given building, right? And so there are a lot of variables that might lean societies toward or away from crime. So the social organization, the way the community in which you live is set up, also affects who you hang out with, what your definitions are, who you can imitate, right? My wife works at a country club, and she, all of her, not all, but the vast majority of her clients are retired. And they're fairly successful retired people because they are members of a expensive country club, right? And so because of that, because of the social organization of who she hangs out with, or of St. Augustine, and where we live, that affects who she associates with. So she associates with a lot of well-to-do people who have had fairly illustrious careers. That affects what she gets reinforced for at work. If she came in with, gauged ears and a nose ring with a teardrop tattoo, they probably wouldn't respond as well to her as they do now, right? And so you see how the social organization here is different. If you have, gauged ears in Manhattan, no one really cares, right? Because there's 50 million people there. You got every possible thing in New York. Your differential location in the social structure is the second variable. And these are the socio-demographic characteristics that indicate niches within larger society. So where you fit in society affects your social learning, which affects your deviance, right? So class, gender, race, marital status all indicate positions of social standing, right? Typically, if you're an upper class white male who's married, you've got a really good shot of being successful and probably not too terribly criminal, largely, right? Probabilistically. And that's because you might have access to better things. You might have access to better people with better connections, right? And so you associate with different people. You have different definitions of what's acceptable or not, right? Probably if you are an upper class white male, college is not an option, right? It is probably very much expected that you are going to college, right? Grad school might not even be an option at that point. There's no question about whether or not you're going to get married, right? And that marital status is actually, especially as far as successful people go, is actually fairly important, which is why more often than not, presidents are married, right? CEOs are married. Important people are married. And so these all indicate your position in the social class or in the society, which also indicate who you hang out with and what's reinforced and who you're going to imitate, right? If you think about it in general, for those of you who've seen Downton Abbey, or if you think about Titanic, the movie Titanic, and I feel like I talk about this in every class, right? Rose was part of a certain social class that Jack was not. Cal and Rose behaved very, very differently because they were reinforced for different things than Jack was. And you could see where Jack didn't mind dabbling in deviance, whereas Cal toward the end kind of did some deviant stuff, but overwhelmingly it was viewed as in poor taste or improper for Cal to do something deviant, right? Because of the reinforcement and imitation based on what was expected of them in that class. There's also theoretically defined structural variables that will affect who you hang out with. These refer to things like autonomy, class oppression, social disorganization, and variables used to identify criminogenic conditions of society. We'll learn more about these theories of delinquency later, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about them, but just know that there are other theoretically defined structural variables that affect your social learning variables. And finally, the fourth variable is differential social location in groups. So individual membership in and relation to primary, secondary, and reference groups like families, friends, and colleagues all affect social learning and the environment in which social learning takes place. If you think about it in general, right? You guys probably have people in your family that are widely different from each other. And they're your brothers and your sisters, right? You guys might have vastly, vastly different friend groups, vastly different kind of behaviors. You might, everyone has that one weird sibling, and if you don't know who the weird sibling is, it's you. But that's a joke. Don't take that personally. Your membership in that group can affect things. My parents joke around that my brother, right, if we just went based off of high school especially, when my brother was born, he was the hopes and dreams of our family. It was their firstborn son. My father spent all sorts of time. My dad would come home from work and my mom would say, please, let's get a sitter and go to a movie. And my dad would say, no, I want to read to my boy, right? I want to spend time with my son. Because of all of that nurturing, and it's 2-on-1, two parents versus one kid, my brother was very, very bright. His whole life still is one of the brightest people I know. Valedictorian of his class. The only reason he stopped at a master's degree is because that's all he needed to become a pastor like he wanted to. And that's what he does. And he literally majored in ancient Greek and Latin so that he could read original biblical texts to be a pastor, right? Well, then I come along and it suddenly starts to become, man coverage instead of a power play. It's man coverage, and so it's 1-to-1, right? But my parents didn't both have time to read to me. They didn't both have time to build into me. They didn't both have time to spend time with me because my brother was also kind of an attention hog, right? Because, my brother and I are 2 years apart, so, 2-year-olds, you can't just say, hey, go read your book in the room and entertain yourself. We've got a new baby to take care of. And so because of that, I achieved well enough, right? But I had different friend groups. Schooling wasn't nearly as... My brother was kind of your stereotypical nerd in school because he just thought like the best thing he could do was come home and tell my parents random facts, and they just thought that was the greatest thing ever. If I came home and said, hey, look what I learned, they'd say, yeah, your brother learned that too. Like, it's not impressive, right? Well, then, 15 months after I was born, my sister comes along. So they go from playing a power play to man defense to now they're playing zone. Right? And so you got to keep my brother, who's 3 at this point, entertained while you're still feeding me some, because I'm only 15 months old, and there's a newborn, right? And so reading with my sister was virtually non-existent because they didn't have time to just sit down, one of them, and read with my sister while my brother and I, who were fairly rowdy and rambunctious, did other things, right? And if my sister came home and said, look at this fact I learned, they're like, oh my God, we didn't care when Josh told us, we certainly don't care when you tell us, right? Not that I'm not suggesting my parents were bad parents at all, and I'm to an extent making light of it, right? But that membership and that relationship within that social group mattered. As far as grandparents are concerned, right? My brother was the very first grandkid, so he also had 4 grandparents that were just doting all over him. Then I came along, and 2 months later, my cousin came along. So my grandparents, it went from 4 grandparents all doting on my brother alone to now there's 3 people that need some doting. And obviously my cousin didn't have the same, both sets of grandparents. They had one set of grandparents similar. But that still kind of affected things. And then by the time my sister came along, there were a whole slew of grandkids. And so all these variables provide the kind of environment in which social learning takes place. And so you can see how different things affect these variables that then expect criminality. Now, we know from the first chapter that there are certain things that need to be present to evaluate a theory. Scope, parsimony, logical consistency, empirical validity, right? The empirical validity of social learning theory is moderate to strong support. There is very, very little negative support. Social learning theory, unequivocally, is the best theory to explain criminal behavior that we have on the books right now. There's a whole bunch of research that just says social learning theory is it. Now, full disclosure, Ron Akers, who wrote social learning theory, was my theory professor in graduate school, right? And so I am a student of Ron Akers, which means I am a social learning student, right? However, for 35 years, 40 years, this theory has been the best theory to define why people commit crime. The most commonly measured variables are differential association and definitions. Imitation and reinforcement are still measured fairly often, but just not as often as association and definition. And the scope of social learning theory is super broad, especially because social learning theory explains not only why some people choose to commit crime, but it also explains why people choose not to commit crime. Research on social structure and social learning theory also has moderate to strong support, suggesting that those environmental factors in which social learning takes place are also very, very present. As far as policy implications of social learning theory, the basic idea is change the definitions, change the peer groups, and reinforce positive behavior. Encourage children to imitate certain role models. Super difficult to do though, right? We explain crime a lot with this, but the policy implications are really, really, really hard to implement. If you get reinforced, if you care what your friend thinks and your friend is an idiot, how can I stop you from caring what they think? Can you do that? I remember growing up, my dad used to tell me all the time if I got picked on at school, which surprisingly, being in the math club, a member of the band, having braces, and being a male cheerleader did not make me the most popular kid in school. And I used to come home and say, Dad, I don't understand why they're making fun of me. And my dad would say, well, I think you're an elephant. And I was like, what? He was like, you're an elephant. I was like, what the heck does that mean? And he was like, are you an elephant? I said, no, I'm not an elephant. He goes, then who cares what your friends think, right? I could say anything I want. They can say whatever they want. It doesn't make it true. Who cares what they think? To which my answer was, I care. I care what they think. What do you mean, who cares? I care, right? And so it's hard to get people to change what they believe about something. It's hard to get people to change not caring what people think. It's hard to reinforce people differently, right? Especially for some physiological reinforcements, right? If you like the feeling when you drink a lot, how do I get you to stop drinking? No, there's a better feeling. It's called being sober. Just trust me. There's not really a good way to do it. In fact, people always say if behaviorism is true, right, and if there are such things as, like positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment, why is it that hangovers don't stop people from drinking a lot? And the answer to that is because when you drink, you get that positive feeling of being drunk, and that's what you associate with drinking. You don't associate the hangover the next day with drinking, right? So how do you change that? There have been several different applied policies that all have somewhat disappointing results in practice. There are some glimmers of hope out there, but really a lot of the policies have not been implemented well because it's so incredibly difficult. How do you convince the jock that no, the nerd group is the group you should hang out with? How do you convince the insecure middle schooler that no, it doesn't matter what the guy or girl you have a crush on thinks, you be your own person? It's pretty difficult to do. However, as a theory of crime and deviance, social learning theory is the gold standard. This is the best theory we have currently. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and let me know, and I will talk to you again soon.